From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Rendezvous with History listeners, welcome back. I'm joined here today with Professor Mark White, Professor of History at Queen Mary University, London. Mark is here today to talk about his new book, The Life and Presidency of John F. Kennedy, Icon, Libertine, Leader. Mark, great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Anthony. Good to be with you.
Well, Mark, what a great time to release this book just in time for Christmas. It's available on Amazon and paperback and ebook and hardcover, I believe. Yes or no?
Indeed.
All right, so you have all three formats. Bloomsbury Press, go out and get it, put it in the stockings, put it under the tree. But if you need a little preview, a little snippet, that's what we're here to do today. So Mark, let me start with this. The Camelot School. You take issue a bit with Kennedy's Camelot. The first wave of historians, many of whom were working with Kennedy during his presidency, who kind of helped foster and create this myth of the JFK presidency. What did they get wrong? What did they get right? How did they set the kind of path forward and the conditions for our remembrance of JFK as such a cornerstone figure in 20th century American history, in the world history?
It's a really interesting question. And it all starts with Jackie Kennedy, which is 1 week after the assassination, exactly 1 week after the assassination. She granted an interview to the journalist Theodore White for Life magazine. And she said during the interview, she mentioned during the interview that on an evening in the White House, she and her late husband, John F. Kennedy, liked to listen to a record of the hit Broadway musical Camelot by Frederick Loewe and Alan J. Lerner. And Theodore White, being the adroit journalist he was, wrote up the article for Life magazine. And at that point, the Kennedy legend had a name, which was Camelot. And the idea was that Kennedy had been such an outstanding president, it was appropriate to think of him in mythical terms, in terms of the Arthurian legend, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And that seemed to have an influence on the early wave of scholarship, which was dominated in particular, as you say, by two Kennedy aides, Arthur Schlesinger, great historian, Theodore Sorensen, his great speechwriter, who both published books in 1965, 1,000 Days by Schlesinger, Kennedy by Sorensen. And the important point is that they weren't just arguing that Kennedy was a fine president. They were arguing that he was a great president. And Theodore Sorensen, for example, made the argument that he couldn't understand how Kennedy could be rated lower than any other 20th century president, which when you think of Franklin Roosevelt pulling America through Great Depression, winning World War II, defeating Adolf Hitler, building a welfare state, is an extraordinary claim. And so I, in this book, I do have a positive take on Kennedy. I do think he's the finest president of his generation. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. I think he's the best of that era. But I think the problem with the Camelot School is the argument was so extreme, it was so hyperbolic that it made inevitable, a response, a historiographical counter-reaction that was just as extreme. And that's what happened by the 80s and 90s. You have three books that come out in the 80s and 90s. Gary Wills, great public intellectual, published a book called The Kennedy Imprisonment. In the early 1990s, Thomas Reeves did a book called A Question of Character. And then the late 1990s, the great investigative journalist Seymour Hersh did a book, The Dark Side of Camelot. And the term I use for that school is the Counter-Camelot School. And they were just as extreme. They basically depicted Kennedy as a depraved human being with an appalling private life, an appalling character, and also a very aggressive Cold Warrior who heated up Cold War tensions. So I think paradoxically, the Camelot School in the end damaged Kennedy's reputation among historians because they made inevitable a counter-reaction that was extreme and portrayed him in an uncharitable way.
One of the things you do in this book, and perhaps is something that the Camelot School didn't get right, was to really show Kennedy's growth. Growth as president, growth as a public figure, growth as a politician. He wasn't, a prophet and perfectly formed and never wrong, but you really show this kind of struggle to get it right. How did that evolve in your writing process, that idea?
So you're exactly right. That's a major theme of the book, which is the idea of the presidency as an education for JFK. And my view on this, Anthony, is that presidents are just like anyone else, like you or me. They're affected by their experiences in life, or at least they should be. They should be affected by their presidential experiences. That requires a certain open-mindedness. Not all presidents have that, I think, but Kennedy did. And my basic take on that is that he's clearly a very gifted politician. He showed that throughout his political career. But when he becomes president, I think he's a little too. He's basically fairly tough on Cold War issues, and not as strongly committed to progressive issues at home, specifically civil rights, as he would become. But two experiences really changed him. One is the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. And, it's one thing to understand in an abstract theoretical sense that, nuclear war could happen. It's another thing to live through something like that when you and one other guy on the other side of the world, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, are responsible for whether there's going to be World War III, a nuclear apocalypse. And it's really a visceral experience for Kennedy. And in the weeks that follow, he says he said to an aide, he said, it's just incredible. I myself and Nikita Khrushchev have the ability to destroy the whole of the world, the whole of Western civilization anyway. And press conference, he talked about how he's very worried about the future in terms of nuclear weapons, the dissemination of nuclear weapons to other powers. And so it really creates in him a deep desire to reduce Cold War tensions and to make the world safer. And that manifests itself in 1963, as you know, Anthony, one with the American University speech on the 10th of June 1963 in Washington, D.C., quite an extraordinary piece of rhetoric in the context of the Cold War, where he urges the American people to change their attitude towards the Russian people, towards the Soviet Union, and towards the Cold War. He said, no political system is so iniquitous that it means its people are lacking in virtue. And then following on from that, he signs the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was of historic importance, the first agreement in the Cold War limiting nuclear testing. So that argument doesn't work if you suggest that he's gone from being an aggressive Cold Warrior to a peacenik. That didn't happen. He still believes the Cold War is a going concern. He still believes the Soviet Union is a major challenge. Communism is a major threat, and that has to be taken seriously. But he's determined to explore whatever options. In a sense, not dissimilar from Ronald Reagan. He's determined to explore whatever options he can to reduce Cold War tensions and make the Cold War safer. Domestically, the seminal experience is the Birmingham Civil Rights Crisis in the spring of 1963. So in Birmingham, Alabama, which Martin Luther King described as the most racially segregated city in the American South, Martin Luther King and other civil rights protesters, leaders organized peaceful protests in the spring of 1963, including children. And, the local police force attacked the peaceful protesters in a kind of draconian fashion. This was front page news. This was major television news. Kennedy said he felt sickened by what he'd seen, and it massively deepens his commitment to civil rights. And he believes that, it's become a moral necessity, and also it's politically feasible now in the wake of Birmingham. And on the 11th of June 1963, he gives, interestingly, the day after that American University address, on the 11th of June 1963, he gives a television speech to the American people in which, for the first time in the 20th century, he defines equal rights as a moral issue, not just a political issue, not just a legal issue, but a moral issue. And he said this as old as the scriptures, as old as the Bible, and as clear as the Constitution. Do we believe people are equal or not? And then he introduces the Civil Rights Bill to end racial segregation, which will pass after his death in 1964 during Lyndon Johnson's presidency. But just to add, Anthony, one of the arguments I make in the book is I sort of take on Eisenhower revisionism. As you know, a major development in presidential historical literature in recent decades is the idea that Eisenhower was an absolutely outstanding president, one of the best. And I think Eisenhower certainly had strengths as a president, shortcomings as well. But I could never imagine Eisenhower making the speech that Kennedy made on the 11th of June and bringing that kind of moral urgency to it. So I think, by the end of his presidency, he's more strongly committed to civil rights, and he's more strongly committed to reducing Cold War tensions. And that's because he's learned by his presidential experiences, specifically the missile crisis in October 62 and Birmingham, Alabama, spring 63. So you're quite right. That is a major theme of the book. Yeah.
Well, the learning experiences are very clear for both foreign and domestic policy, and I think it's worth getting into further detail about what his legacy and achievements are in the domestic and foreign policy space. And I know, Mark, you don't see the ratings game as trivial. You see it as actually an important exercise for American citizens. Certainly, we're at rating game season. After the end of every presidency, we see C-SPAN and other outlets gather up a number of historians to rate the presidents. So let's help out our friends and try to figure out Kennedy's place here in the rating system. And first, let's turn to the domestic policy. We hear a lot about the Bay of Pigs. We hear a lot about Berlin Missile Crisis. We hear a lot about, Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin blockade. We hear a lot less about Kennedy's domestic programs. So do me a favor, sketch out the kind of 5 features of Kennedy's domestic programs. Was the New Frontier a success? Was it a failure? How do you judge it in the context of its time?
Again, it's a really interesting question. And I think what some people might feel is that he was a better foreign policy president than he was a domestic policy president. He was certainly more interested. When Ted Sorensen, his great speechwriter, went to work for him shortly after he was elected to the Senate, Kennedy asked Sorensen, if you were appointed to a presidential cabinet, what position would you accept? Would you like? And I think he said Secretary of the Treasury or something like that. And JFK said, I have no interest in that. I'd be Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. And it's true that ever since he was a Harvard undergraduate, international affairs was something that he was preoccupied with. Just let me make this point. I think one of the misconceptions about Kennedy throughout his political career is that he was a kind of quintessential liberal, another Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt. And for most of his political career, he was not. He was, in the center of politics. He said privately, long before he was president, I'm not a liberal. I never have been. And he had tense relationships with leading liberal figures in the Democratic Party, like Adlai Stevenson, like Eleanor Roosevelt. On the other hand, to win the Democratic presidential nomination in 1960, he needs to have liberal support. And so he does come to adopt liberal positions. When he becomes president, he doesn't unveil anything as sweeping as Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but he does have a fairly ambitious program. And he introduces at the start of his presidency what he calls his 5 must bills: housing, increase in the minimum wage, an important education bill, a Medicare bill, medical care for the aged, and so on. And if you look at his record on those, what he described as his 5 must bills, it's mixed. He gets some of them through and some of them he doesn't. And actually, probably the 2 biggest bills he wanted to get passed at the start of his presidency, education and Medicare, he doesn't get those bills passed. And it's a similar dynamic with, say, Franklin Roosevelt in the late 30s. Republicans and Southern conservative Democrats worked to block his program. But if you look at his domestic record as a whole, he still gets a significant amount of legislation through. And one area where he's very strong, and I think we know from presidential elections, the American people attach a lot of importance to this. One area where he's very strong is the economy. if you look at his presidential record in terms of growth rates, it's very high. You can make the case that it's the best of any president since World War II. Certainly one of the very best. Again, comparing that to Dwight Eisenhower, everyone always thinks of the 50s as a time of, great prosperity and so on. And for many people it was, but there were three recessions. There were three recessions during the Eisenhower presidency. There were none during Kennedy's presidency. And he also gets passed legislation which probably helps the country economically, like the Trade Expansion Act. And also, interestingly, towards the end of his presidency, and this might seem not something to be anticipated with a Democratic president, he became strongly supportive of a tax cut, which will be implemented again after his assassination. So I think his domestic record, there's some really important achievements, particularly in the economy, and things like increase in the minimum wage, aid to depressed areas, for poor areas in the country. But the most important thing is civil rights. That's the transcendent domestic issue, the key domestic issue of his presidency. And although some people criticize him for moving too slowly on it, and I think you can make that argument persuasively, by 1963, with that speech on the 11th of June, he makes a very strong commitment to equal rights. And this is the point I would emphasize, Anthony, is, Kennedy was as shrewd a politician as you'd get. And he understood the political price to be paid for his stance on civil rights. And remember, this is just a year out from what he anticipates will be his re-election presidential campaign in 1964, which is just at that time, inevitably, he would lose support from white Southerners. And if you look at poll ratings, his poll ratings in the South, in the spring of 63, they are 70% approval ratings. By September, it's down to 44%. And his overall approval ratings dropped, therefore, really significantly. They're still high by modern standards today, but they drop precipitously. And so I think that speaks really well to his moral compass, which is that he was prepared to do the right thing on civil rights, even though he knew it was going to cause some problems in 1964.
Well, I want to triangulate here a little bit, both in the context of domestic policy and specifically in how you mentioned that Kennedy didn't always think of himself as a liberal, certainly not in the earlier part of his career, in the legislative part of his career. And I want to triangulate with three people in particular. The Roosevelt legacy, really. I mean, obviously, FDR has passed away, although Eleanor is still around and a leading progressive force. Joe McCartney, who is perhaps unusually close to Kennedy for those of us who think about where Kennedy's legacy has gone. And then Lyndon Johnson, who has a kind of a much greater focus, or at least a much greater historical record on domestic policy issues, it would seem, with, as you pointed out, the Great Society programs, than Kennedy. Can you triangulate his relationship with those three, and why the intimacy with one and the distance with the other two is somewhat surprising?
Yeah, another great question. Three fascinating individuals: FDR, McCarthy, LBJ. So with FDR, I think his sort of lack of massive enthusiasm for FDR, which is surprising, given that he was a Democrat and FDR was his president as a young man, is to do with his father, Joe Kennedy Sr.'s relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. Joe Kennedy wanted to be a real political player in the 30s. He supports Franklin Roosevelt. I think he does have aspirations to be president himself one day. And the high point of his political career is when he is appointed as the US ambassador here in London in the late 1930s. And he sees that as a stepping stone to the White House. But that represents the high point of his political career and its end, because he's a deeply controversial ambassador. And that's because of his views. He's pro-isolationist, pro-appeasement. And, after World War II starts, that's deeply problematic. And so in the end, he falls out with FDR. FDR falls out with him. And after he resigns the ambassadorship, that's the end of his political career. and FDR keeps him at arm's length. He doesn't use him again. And I think so. I think for JFK, family is always incredibly important. And so when he was at Harvard, he didn't join liberal organizations on campus. And a friend said there was nothing about FDR that excited JFK, which is very, very interesting, I think. In terms of McCarthy, he becomes a family friend. He is elected as senator for Wisconsin. He comes to Washington at the same time as JFK. He's Irish, like JFK. He's Catholic. A British friend who went around to JFK's house once, I think in the late 40s, early 50s, when JFK's in Congress. He said to JFK, "What are you doing tonight?" And JFK said, "Well, I'm going out with Joe McCarthy." So they socialized. Joe Kennedy, JFK's father, really liked Joe McCarthy. It's said that he dated at least one of JFK's sisters, maybe two. So, yeah, I mean, I think the ideological significance of this issue is, JFK's early views on the Cold War and on foreign policy were quite hardline. He strongly believed in the importance of military power in dealing with the Soviet Union. It was important to deal with them from a position of strength. Again, interesting parallel with Ronald Reagan. In 1949, so this is a year before McCarthy really comes to the fore. He basically criticizes Franklin Roosevelt and Truman for allowing China to go communist, not taking a tough enough stance. So I think, McCarthy's whole line that, the US is being too soft on communism. In terms of foreign policy, JFK has some sympathy for that. And of course, the other thing is Bobby Kennedy ends up going to work for Joe McCarthy. So he said later, JFK, "How could I come out strongly against Joe McCarthy when my own brother worked for him?" And but it is really in the end a kind of moral failing, because McCarthy did trample on civil liberties in America in the end, and he is the only Democrat in the Senate not to vote or pair in favor of the censure of McCarthy. And that's something that liberals like Eleanor Roosevelt would never, forgive him for. In terms of Lyndon Johnson, well, of course, he asked Lyndon Johnson to be his vice presidential running mate in 1960. In 1960, when he runs for the Democratic presidential nomination, Johnson turns out to be his chief rival. And Johnson wants to stop Kennedy getting the nomination on the first ballot. He almost achieves that, actually, but Kennedy just wins on the first ballot. And then he asks Johnson to be his vice presidential running mate. A lot of liberals at the convention in 60 were very unhappy with that. And it's the start of a terrible relationship between Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy. As you know, they developed not just a dislike, but an unbelievable hatred, an unbelievable antipathy for each other. I think with JFK, he was always, when Lyndon Johnson was vice president, he was always respectful towards Johnson. There was this issue, as with a lot of vice presidents in those days, what do you do with them? Because it could be a largely ceremonial position in those days. So often it would involve sending Johnson overseas. What is interesting is, after the assassination, is Johnson's relationship to the Kennedy legacy. One, in terms of Vietnam, he feels obliged to uphold Kennedy's commitments. And the way he perceives that, one of those is to, maintaining a non-communist government in South Vietnam. But of course, in terms of domestic policy, Johnson goes far beyond what Kennedy envisaged in terms of domestic reform. And, I think Johnson wanted to be a genuinely great president. He wanted to be another Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to be another Franklin Roosevelt. And, he does achieve great things, for example, in civil rights, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. But I think, if John Kennedy had still been around in the mid and late 60s and had observed the Great Society, I think he would have argued that Johnson went too far, that it would lead to the Democratic Party losing support from moderate swing voters. It was taking the Democratic Party too far to the left. I think he had a much more, limited vision of liberal reform than Johnson's sort of sweeping vision. Three absolutely fascinating relationships.
I want to get into Kennedy's appearance on the public stage as a public figure. I mean, you painted the relationship with these three kind of titans of Democratic politics. Sorry, two titans of Democratic politics, one titan of Republican politics in that era. Kennedy becomes a titan of his own, really, say in 1940, with a book that, frankly, many historians haven't spent as much time reviewing or focusing on, or say plumbing for its impact on his worldview and his development. And that's Kennedy's first book, Why England Slept, released in 1940. You really give a fascinating background into how he developed the thoughts that were part of this book, and how that book became so crucial to his image, a young JFK. Tell me a little bit about that.
It's a really, really interesting issue. And I agree with you, Anthony. I think it's a really important part of the Kennedy story. I mean, anyone who wants to know about Kennedy's approach to foreign policy, the kind of bedrock of it, the foundation of it, I would say start with Why England Slept. So this was an undergraduate thesis that he wrote at Harvard University. I think if memory serves, it was called Appeasement at Munich when it was submitted as a thesis at Harvard. It was well received by the faculty there, received a good grade. And it came out in the summer of 1940 as his first book, and it was a success. It got reviewed in major newspapers. It sold tens of thousands of copies, and it's the start of his public image in the United States. So this is 6 years before he's elected to Congress, which is in 1946. So if you look at the issue of the development of his image, it doesn't start in 46; it starts in 40, and this helps create part of his image that will remain until Dallas 63, which is that he's not an ordinary politician. He's a cultured figure. He's a man of letters, a literary figure, because, as you know, he'll go on 16 years later to produce a second book, Profiles in Courage, which wins a Pulitzer. The extent of his authorship of that book is contested, but nevertheless, Why England Slept's really important in terms of creating this idea of Kennedy as a sophisticated thinker, not just an ordinary politician. So it's important in terms of his image, but it's really important also in terms of his approach to foreign policy, because studying the issue of appeasement, the British appeasement of Nazi Germany, he just comes to the conclusion that it had been an egregious error, and that what the British should have done was to rearm quickly and to deal with Hitler from a position of strength. And so for the rest of his life, he believes in that. He believes in a strong military, that you deal with Nazi Germany from a position of military strength, or once the Cold War begins, you deal with the Soviet Union from a position of strength. That is the absolute bedrock of his approach to foreign policy. And it was often used to be said, I think it is statistically true, that up until that point, when he becomes president, he carries out the largest peacetime increase in US military spending in history. And to understand that, you have to go all the way back to Why England Slept. He will refine his views on foreign policy in later years. They'll become more sophisticated and nuanced. He develops in the 50s a greater understanding of the force of nationalism, say in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. As I say, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he becomes more determined to reduce Cold War tensions. But he always believes in the importance of military power in how you approach foreign policy, and that goes all the way back to Why England Slept.
Yeah, so let's trace that view, that thinking through some of the key foreign policy challenges he faces, crises he faces. I want to hear your thoughts on the classics, so to speak, on the Berlin blockade, on the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the Bay of Pigs, and of course his symmetry with Khrushchev is worth commenting on here as well. Pull that line of thinking forward for us.
Yeah. Well, initially, his foreign policy is disastrous because the big decision he needs to make at the start of his presidency is, does he authorize an invasion at the Bay of Pigs? So this was a plan which had been developed towards the end of the Eisenhower presidency by the CIA to use Cuban exiles to carry out an invasion of Cuba, to trigger an uprising against Castro, and to overthrow him. And he decides to give the go-ahead for that operation. He changes it in ways logistically that make it less likely it will succeed. And of course, it turns out to be a humiliating failure. When the operation fails in mid-April 61, there is an account of him walking out in the gardens of the White House at 3:34 in the morning and by himself. He just couldn't. It was the first thing that had gone disastrously wrong in his whole political career. And the decision he has to make then is like, what do I do about Castro now? And his liberal advisors, so people like Adlai Stevenson, who's his ambassador at the United Nations, just say, don't obsess about Castro. You need to rely more on diplomacy to isolate him in the Western Hemisphere and so on. But the decision he basically makes is to continue to work for the overthrow of Castro. And so in November 1961, he launches Operation Mongoose, which is a top secret CIA operation, the aim of which is to bring about an uprising against Castro and then to send in US forces to make sure that Castro is overthrown. That defines his policy towards Cuba in the year preceding the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then in early June 61, he meets for the only time during his presidency with his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev. That's in Vienna, the 3rd and 4th of June 1961. It's the only time they meet during his presidency. They had met in 1959 when Khrushchev came to the United States, met a delegation of senators, including Kennedy. And Khrushchev apparently said to him on that occasion, I've heard about you and I hear you've got a great future. They meet, there's this sort of stereotype about the Vienna summit, which is that basically Khrushchev dominated, browbeat, intimidated a younger, experienced leader. And I've read very carefully through the full transcripts of the Vienna summit. And I think that's a totally misleading characterization of the summit. Khrushchev was belligerent, bellicose, demanded Kennedy get out of Berlin. But if you read the transcript, every time Kennedy stands up to him in a very sort of calm way. He was shocked afterwards at Khrushchev's belligerence, but he makes clear to Khrushchev that he is not going to back down over Berlin. He's not going to leave West Berlin. And Khrushchev gives him 6 months to do so, which is why Berlin dominates the summer of 1961. The question for Kennedy is, how do I respond to Khrushchev's threats over Berlin? He meets with his advisors. He rejects the more extreme options, which are given to him by Dean Acheson, Harry Truman's former Secretary of State, whom JFK uses as an ad hoc advisor. And Acheson wants Kennedy to declare a state of national emergency, to countenance the possibility that maybe this will end up in nuclear war. And Kennedy rejects that more extreme approach, but he does basically respond. And Anthony, it's right out of Why England Slept. He gives a speech on the 25th of July, 1961, 6-7 weeks after the Vienna summit, where he announces, I'm responding by substantially increasing our military power. I'm increasing the size of our army, our navy, air force. I'm calling up the reservists. I'm going to increase spending on the military on top of the increases I've already announced. So what he's basically saying to Khrushchev is, I'm not going to back down, and I'm preparing the nation militarily for this crisis. And of course, in the end, Khrushchev does back down, in effect, by authorizing the building of the Berlin Wall, which stops people fleeing from East Germany to West Germany, but it means the West can retain a presence in Berlin. So Kennedy basically deserves high marks for his handling of the Berlin crisis. It signposts one of the strengths of his presidency, which is he's very good at crisis management. He's got this Beyond Borg-like sort of coolness under pressure, where he just remains cool, calm, and collected. And he's good at managing crises. Berlin's a good example. It also, I think, is the start of, or at least part of the process where he becomes wary of his own generals. They always seem to want the most extreme options. And so I think that's part of his political education. 62, the biggest foreign policy issue he has to deal with is the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. He's lying in bed, 9 a.m., Tuesday, 16th of October 1962. McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, comes in and says, look, the Russians have put nuclear missiles in Cuba. It's the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It will last 13 days until the 28th of October. And initially, he has to decide how I'm going to respond. The consensus, which he shares initially, is that they'll have to bomb Cuba. But he keeps an open mind and changes his view and comes to support a naval blockade. That will stop the Soviets from sending in any more nuclear missiles, but it won't remove the missiles that are already there. And so he'll need to negotiate those out. And in the end, he does so. By the 28th of October, he reaches a political settlement with Khrushchev where he publicly promises not to invade Cuba and privately, off the record, says he will remove US Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which he didn't mind doing anyway, because in technological terms, they were really, old-fashioned, sort of anachronistic missiles. And they were replaced with Polaris anyway. So, again, it's another example of his very successful crisis management. Also, again, part of this process where he becomes wary of his own generals, because I'm thinking of one meeting in particular during the first week of the Cuban Missile Crisis where he meets with the generals, and they just basically say you have to go ahead and bomb Cuba, and he just says to them, look, the problem with what you're saying is you're just thinking about this in a military sense. You're not putting it in a broader political context. If we bomb Cuba, what is Khrushchev's going to do? Something. Is he going to bomb Berlin, Turkey? You need to think about the political consequences of this. So it's also part of that process where he becomes cautious when dealing with his own generals in terms of what they propose in foreign policy. In 1963, you've got two main developments. One, as I've said earlier, is he moves to reduce Cold War tensions, hence his remarkable American University speech, hence the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. At the same time, by the summer of 1963, particularly by the late summer of 1963, Vietnam emerges for the first time as the biggest foreign policy issue. And I think it's easy to read history kind of backwards that way, which is you just assume Vietnam was a huge issue through its whole presidency. I think it's the distinguished historian Robert Dallek who points out, if you look at his press conferences for much of 1962, he's often not asked a single question by the press on Vietnam. And there are many press conferences in 1963 where he's not asked a single question. He's asked about relations with Russia, relations with Cuba. So I think Kennedy, he doesn't really focus on Vietnam till August, September 1963. The big issue there is, there's two issues. One is, what is his record on Vietnam? In a nutshell, he increased US military presence in South Vietnam from 600 US military officials to about 16, 17,000. So that's a significant increase. That is a long way away from the 500,000 soldiers that Lyndon Johnson will end up with in Vietnam. But at the same time, he always refuses to send combat troops. There are times when it's recommended to him by his advisors that he sends combat troops. He always refuses to do that. I think he's instinctively cautious. The other question with Vietnam is, what would he have done? And historians disagree a lot over that. Would he have made the same decision as Lyndon Johnson? And my view on that is, in the end, I think it's most likely that he would not have gone to war in Vietnam the way that Lyndon Johnson did. As I've said, he was more capable of rejecting advice from his generals than Johnson was. He's had this huge foreign policy triumph with the Cuban Missile Crisis, so he doesn't need to prove himself in national security terms in the way that Lyndon Johnson did. And also just in terms of the overall trajectory of his foreign policy, as I've said, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's moving to reduce Cold War tensions. So if you extrapolate that into 64, 65, I think it's most likely that he would have not gone to war in Vietnam. But I will say this, I think he's less sure-footed on Vietnam in, say, the autumn of 1963 than he is, say, on Berlin in 1961 or the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, just because he'd thought about it less. He'd given less thought to it.
Well, let's use that opportunity to kind of engage with your final chapter, the end of your book, really, and something that really occupies, I think, a central part of your thinking in writing this, and that is what would have been. What would have been if that bullet was, misfired, or and Lee Harvey Oswald missed, and Kennedy lives. What's your estimation?
So it is an important question, and it does relate to several issues connected to the Kennedy presidency, particularly Vietnam. That's the biggest hypothetical issue. And it is very, very difficult. By definition, it's unprovable. It's hypothetical. So in the end, a historian can argue whatever they want, but you just need to look at all the different factors. And as I've said, for all the reasons that I cited, moving to reduce Cold War tensions, the big foreign policy triumph with the missile crisis, skepticism towards his own generals, and just this kind of caution He tends to be cautious in public policy. It's just a massive contrast with his private life, where he's unbelievably reckless in his private life, but in public policy, he tends to be cautious. He doesn't really like to go out on a line for anything. So I think for all those reasons, it's most likely he would have avoided a war in Vietnam. One other issue which comes up is this policy directive he signs a month before his assassination, which is NSAM 263, National Security Action Memorandum 263, which authorizes the withdrawal of 1,000 US military personnel from South Vietnam. Now, some would regard that as concrete evidence that he planned to get out of Vietnam. I mean, I think that's an overstatement. But on the other hand, the fact that he does that suggests that he is open to the idea of de-escalation in Vietnam ultimately. With domestic policy, the big issue is, would he have got the Civil Rights Bill through in 1964 as Lyndon Johnson did? Now, we all know Lyndon Johnson had phenomenal legislative abilities honed during his time as Senate Majority Leader. And would Kennedy have been able to get the Civil Rights Bill through? It was making progress through the House at the time of his assassination, and I think it's most likely he would have got it through, but it would not have been easy. Of course, one issue in terms of his legacy, which is obviously significant, is would he have got re-elected in '64? And as I said, he lost support in the South after his stance on civil rights. But I think the evidence is he would have won in '64. He would have defeated Barry Goldwater and would have done so very comfortably. And it was important to him. I mean, he said, if I'm not re-elected in 1964, no one's going to care about my presidency, my legacy. I need to win in '64. And I think it's most likely he would have done comfortably, easily. And I say that in particular because of his overall popularity as president. It's somewhat paradoxical in the sense that, as you know, the 1960 election with Richard Nixon is so close. It's just a wafer-thin margin of victory. But if you look at his approval ratings, his average approval ratings, 70%. His average in any 1 week, that is higher than any president since World War II. And I mean, even after the Bay of Pigs, and he couldn't understand this because it had obviously been a terrible failure, his approval ratings go into the 80s following the Bay of Pigs. So I think you can assume that popularity over the course of his presidency would have translated into a comfortable victory in '64. One other hypothetical issue, Anthony, that I think one needs to touch on is the question of his controversial private life. Because, for example, I think I'm right in saying, if I remember, Thomas Reeves, who wrote this very successful book, A Question of Character, criticizing Kennedy's character and private life, I seem to recall he raised the issue, could Kennedy have been impeached in a second term? And given his extraordinary private life, I think it's okay to raise that issue. I think that almost certainly would not have been the case. Kennedy is on the record as saying that he knew the press wouldn't report on his private life when he was president, because that's what journalists did in those days. They weren't prurient. They didn't comment publicly on those sorts of things. That was also true with Lyndon Johnson. So his private life was really a non-issue politically during his presidency up until '63. And I think it would have been a non-issue had he served out a second term.
And it's interesting, and something that we'll leave for listeners as a cliffhanger, so they make sure and they go out and buy your book. But that disconnect between his private life, his image, and where character kind of fits in between those two things is a really central motif of your book. Right now, I want to pivot, though, to our hints for history section, Mark. And what is your hint for history?
So if someone wanted to do something on Kennedy's presidency or Kennedy's life, what I would suggest is his domestic policies. There is one really, fine book by a fine scholar on his domestic policies called Promises Kept by a scholar called Irving Bernstein, which is a a positive view of Kennedy's domestic policies, which would go against what others might think. But that book came out at the start of the 1990s. It's a third of a century ago. So, a lot's been written on Kennedy in Vietnam, Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think if someone wants to do sort of fresh work, someone doing a PhD or just an undergraduate dissertation, or indeed a scholar looking for fresh material, I think domestic policy would be a good area to explore.
All right. Well, everyone, listeners, thank you to Mark White once again. That book is The Presidency and Life of John F. Kennedy, Icon, Libertine Leader, available wherever you purchase your books. Mark, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Anthony. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.